Thank you very much. Scott has provided a great, I think, framework for thinking about this in, and I thought I would pick up in a couple of different directions. But just in summary at the beginning, we are being watched by the state and by corporations in ways I think we never thought imaginable. At the same time, our democratic right to know is being threatened, and to some extent we never had it in the beginning. Recently, an issue of a journal that I read sometimes called Monthly Review from the United States put out an issue called Surveillance Capitalism, calling the sort of regime in which we live surveillance capitalism. And I think that's quite good. I think we need to look at both the corporations and the state and the way those two things are coming together. Now, I'm not an expert on the corporation side of it at all, or really on the state side of it. But it seems to me that over the top of massive corporations like Google, you have organisations like the NSA, which, as we know, the CIA, the NSA is now absolutely linked and has been for a long time with our own intelligence agencies. And I think that's very important that when we think about our own intelligence services, we think about them in the sense that we are a client state to the United States, and I think that has been absolutely apparent in recent weeks. I'd like to say it's so easy to think about us, to fall into this whole idea of us and them. You know, we are not, you know, certainly in my life I've been subject to ASIO surveillance, but you know, it's so easy to slip into a sort of comfortable sort of middle class assumption that yes, you know, there is all this massive surveillance out there, and of course I would be part of that. But no, whatever political activities you engage in, it is more us, it is more them over there, perhaps in Lakemba, who are really the targets. And while there may be some truth in that, I really think we need to avoid that us and them. It is we. We are in this together, and we are the subjects of surveillance. And that's not to say we don't have to take an investive interest in what is going on in particularly targeted communities, but this whole us and them thing, that dichotomy has got a huge problem built into it. Now, in Australia, because we don't have a Bill of Rights, we have far less protection from the powers that the intelligence agencies and the police forces are giving. And right now, as Scott has said this week, I read the report on the ASIO bill last night, admittedly pretty quickly. There were things in there that I certainly hadn't heard from the Australian media in its reporting on Parliament or on the bill. But we need to remember that over the last 13 years, or 12 or 13 years, there's been a gross increase in ASIO and police powers, many of which are mirrored in different bills. In 2005, they were then trying to bring in a particular section into an anti-terrorism bill, which would mean that journalists could be locked up if they talked to anyone who had been subject to an ASIO operation. That particular section in that particular bill, I note, was stopped by a huge amount of activity on the ground from civil liberties organisations, from journalists' organisations, from the Greens and others, but it was already in some other pieces of legislation. And I'm not sure that anyone is really on top of not that in my research I've been able to find any neat summary at this stage just of how much power the police forces have. Particularly poor in this regard is New South Wales. The legislation that was passed by the Labor Party when in government in New South Wales is just as threatening as anything that is currently being proposed by the current government. And I think it's most, you know, as Scott says, there is a unity there at the moment, but the Labor Party's record in relation to this is a very poor one. Look, I thought, for the rest of what I want to say, I'll focus a little bit historically and then a little bit on the role of journalists and the media. The first thing to say is that scepticism in relation to intelligence agencies and the powers they have is absolutely historically justified. Activities of the use of the power of intelligence agencies is very much been focused in favour of the authoritarian, anti-democratic right, whether in capitalist societies or even in the previous socialist states, where intelligence agencies were used against democratic forces. So there's absolutely no reason to think that it's going to be put to democratic use in the protection of democracy. The most heinous crimes were committed by the CIA and continue to be. If any of you have read Jeremy Scales' Dirty Wars, you can get an excellent history there. But, right through the 70s and 80s, there were interference with governments, targeted assassinations. There was a pushback on that, but then an absolute acceleration of it through drone technology and that sort of thing. So there is a history there. Just my own experience, I guess, with ASIO, when I came to read my own ASIO file from the 1970s and my brother's ASIO file, the thing that really struck me most was, not the surveillance on myself, but more how my family got caught up in it. My mother, my sister who was still at school, my sister who was a doctor, trips overseas, trips to China to study acupuncture, all of that was just part of what was of interest to ASIO. Now, I can't say that a huge amount of damage was necessarily done through all of that, but nevertheless, it is a reminder that whenever there is surveillance, most of the people who are the subject of surveillance are innocent of any crime of any sort, or even of any strong dissent. But I've been thinking quite a lot about the Hilton bombing in recent days, and what's happening at the moment has a very familiar feel there. I don't know, some of you were barely born when the Hilton bombing went off at the end of the 1970s. Others of you remember it just like I do. But at the time, the federal police were pushing for more powers, and we had a CHOGM conference here in Sydney. Now, a bomb went off and 2 people were killed and another person very badly damaged. And, we still don't know who planted that bomb. That crime was never solved. However, what we do know is that 3 men were framed by a person who was a special branch infiltrator, Richard Seary. 3 people went to prison for a number of years. There was then an inquiry. That inquiry never really got to the bottom of the role of the special branch back then, which was our sort of state police intelligence. And as well as that, Tim Anderson was ultimately framed and sent to prison on the Hilton bombing on the basis of a fantasy. I did some journalism on this at the time, and a fantasy which any amount of investigation could show was not true. But nevertheless, that was all played through the media, played through the courts. He did go to prison. And behind it all was this desire for more power. That was the context. It wasn't necessarily the reason why the bomb was planted, although, as I said, we never know whether or not ASIO was involved in that. So I think the history, why I mention the history, is I think it is important to have a historical knowledge and a scepticism to actually be able to explain to people that it's not just that we don't like Abbott at the moment and we don't like being involved in these endless wars and the hundreds of thousands of people who were killed in Iraq on the basis of a lie. Yes, we don't like all that, but there is a very strong basis for scepticism about the likely use of the powers. And it's interesting to see the way Abbott phrases it. He says, of course, we want to protect our fundamental values. However, we will do whatever we see as necessary to uphold what we see as right. So that is the first thing. He will do whatever he sees as necessary. So as I said, I think a historical perspective is important, a knowledge of how it works to the extent that we can ever find out. And there I'd like to just mention, of course, the really important work that people like Snowden, who's now, of course, virtually in a state of exile, Chelsea Manning, who is going to spend years in prison, the really WikiLeaks, I think also Julian Assange, the really quite sort of heroic acts that have taken, that people have taken to actually bring some of the truth to us. But then just talking briefly about the media. The ASIO laws that are going to go through this week, as Scott says, very likely they're going to go through. There was a lot of alarm from the media about the fact that if you reveal as a journalist one of these specialist sort of special operations which are going to have remarkably little oversight that can actually involve people committing criminal acts, agents involved in criminal acts in order to either reveal conspiracies or entrap people, whatever the case may be. It's not going to be possible if a journalist finds out about any of that to report it without themselves being liable to imprisonment. And I won't go further into that, except that looks like it will go through. And of course that is a very big worry, because as Scott says, the ability of the media to report these things, in a sense the media stands in for the public. But on the other hand, so all of that is a really big threat, and at the moment shield laws, I would say to any young journalist, you've absolutely got to learn to encrypt. I've really got to learn to encrypt myself. However, there also is going to be sections where you can be compelled to undo that encryption. But then there is the other side of the media, and I'd just like to finish on this point. What is so disappointing, but what is not surprising, and there's also a long history of this, is when the media is complicit in the exercise of symbolic power and in projecting a police view in an uncritical way. And it's easy to point at News Corp in relation to this. To some extent, you can read what ASIO wants through the pages of News Corp or online in News Corp if you wish to. But then yesterday to read an article in the Sydney Morning Herald by Tom Allard, who I would say is a very, very competent reporter, and to read down a description of the raids last week, and not to get to the word allege, which is absolutely required in crime reporting. It is, it's standard. You're taught this. You can't get an article published without it if you're working in a major organisation. And to see that all of that can just be dropped. And also that the serious questions had not been asked at the press conferences, except by, I'd like to mention one young journalist, Paul Farrell, proudly a graduate of UTS journalism. But Paul was, and it's not an easy thing to do for a journalist to stand up, he's from The Guardian, and ask about the use of detention without charge. To be surrounded by other reporters, none of whom want you to do it, is not a easy thing. And that's why I'd just like to finish on saying that I agree with Scott that the media has a crucial role to play. Sadly, most of it will not play that role. Most of it will play a role of amplifying the power of intelligence agencies and pushing for that. But at the same time, we need to support those journalists and all those activists for, like Open Australia, all the public right to know activists and those people who are trying to develop new technologies. We need to be very active in our support of them. Thank you.